Hi, everybody. I'm here to talk to you today a little bit more about poverty. As before, there is a lecture in your hub already around poverty, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about some specific parts of this. It won't be too long, but I wanted to weave some stuff together for you. So, first of all, this is just one exploration of how poverty can occur and become a persistent issue. There are some factors that are incredibly common, and we'll touch on those. But everybody's story is unique, and so there's lots of different ways to get there. First of all, most people don't become poor and unstable in a slow way. It usually is a cascade of events that happens rather quickly. So, these are some common triggers for that. So, a job loss or hours reduced. And, you know, we talk about having a certain cushion of savings in the bank in order to prevent a job loss or reduction in hours from becoming a immediate crisis. But when you are already in a low wage job, or you are not from a resourced family, that's another way of saying your family doesn't have money, right? It is very difficult to do that. And there's also, a lot of cultural stuff going around about the importance of saving versus spending. And, some cultures emphasize one over the other quite heavily. And that can really cause an issue here when it comes to not having any cushion behind you in case you stumble. So another way is medical emergency, especially if you're not insured. So even to say though that even if you are insured, a medical emergency can plunge you into poverty very quickly. It is not just about the medical emergency itself. It can be it can be related very strongly to the job loss, right? So how that would happen would be, if you are an hourly worker and you break your leg or something and you're out for a few days, if you already had some warnings or you exceed the sick days or whatever it is, you can quickly find yourself having lost your job. And then if you weren't insured to start with, you've now lost your job and you have a big medical bill. And those two things together can be really devastating. Divorce or separation, this is especially true for women. So women are much more likely to be poor than men. And this is directly related to childcare expenses and responsibilities. So for the most part, in a single parent household, that single parent is a woman. And in divorce or separation situations, the woman often shoulders the financial burden of the child. And so, in addition to the financial strain of being, suddenly one income or even no income, whereas before there was at least one income, the divorce or separation introduces even more expenses into the situation. Domestic violence, a similar kind of idea in the sense that it can be very sudden, a very sudden change in circumstances that you weren't necessarily planning for. And once again, usually the victims of domestic violence are women, and the same consequences apply. Usually, it would be the woman who has responsibility for the children, and those financial responsibilities theoretically are offset by child support. But In the reality of the situation, often the child support amount is very small or it's not being paid. Um, so, there's a lot of things that can go wrong here to prevent those safety nets from coming into play. Death of a caregiver is much bigger problem than I think we acknowledge. So if you are being cared for by, an aging parent, and you lose your aging parent, and thus you lose the home that you lived in, and you are not able to, hold down a job to support yourself, this is a really good way to end up in poverty. Rent increase, I think that one's pretty obvious. There are some places where rent increase really isn't capped, and a lot of places where it is. But, especially when it's sudden or when it's, the maximum amount every year, that can become untenable very quickly. Car repair or accident, even if you have adequate insurance, this can be a problem because I think the assumption here is that if you don't have adequate insurance, that now you have the burden of replacing the car on your own or fixing the car on your own. However, again, this can play right back into medical emergency and job loss, right? You can have all three of these things together, and you can see how they could travel together and impact each other. So, the bottom line is that if you don't have a adequate cushion of financial resources, one shock is enough. But often the shocks are related to each other, and they can exacerbate each other. So, it's wise from a 65,000 foot view position to say, prioritize having 6 months worth of savings, because that's how much you're supposed to have, is 6 months worth of savings. And if you think about how much money your life costs, that's a lot of money, right? So, prioritize doing that. But in the reality of the situation, most people are not capable of doing that, especially right now when prices are rising in the way that they currently are. Okay. So let's talk some specifics about housing. So missed rent, by the way, we have a book for this in this class. It's There Is No Place for Us. It is uh, an entire book about how these types of factors play into homelessness and kind of uh, edging edge cases of housing. Um, and if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend that you read that book. Okay, so missed rent um, has a whole knock-on set of effects. The the most, dire of these is definitely the eviction. So, the even filing for eviction, even if it's not completed, having an eviction filed against you has really serious consequences for your credit. Even if you pay the whole thing off and you get to stay where you are, your credit is really in trouble at that point. And your credit is essential to finding housing. It is essential to getting car financing with any sort of, non-predatory interest rate, to say nothing of things like mortgages, right? So if you miss rent, especially if you live in a sort of small community, it can be really difficult to find new housing if your housing comes to an end. So you end up moving further and further and further out, or you end up moving to uh, places that are not ideal. Let's put it that way. So after eviction, the commutes get longer, right? Or even if you just have to downgrade, right? The commutes get really long, which costs money, and it's wear and tear on your car and a lot of gas and all of that. There's disruption with regard to school, which is really challenging for children. Oops, sorry about that. And the childcare is a really key part of this situation because if you don't have childcare that is convenient to your job and the school and all of that stuff, it is very, very difficult to hold down a job. And in the financial bracket that we're talking about here, often there is not a lot of flexibility in those jobs. So, you can't just call and say, hey, I have no childcare today. I'm going to work from home. You can't stock the shelves from home. So, we have to think a lot about how all of these things are related to each other and how they can, again, exacerbate each other. Okay. So, just the process of work is work. What does that mean? So, um, you know, for the types of folks that we're talking about here, they tend to be working very highly low wage jobs, right? Like kind of at the bottom. And these almost exclusively have very unstable schedules. So they have a tendency to be part-time shift type jobs. And we're talking about, stocking shelves, waitressing, like that sort of stuff. And those schedules are really unpredictable, which makes it really, really hard to get reliable childcare, to get any assistance from your community or from your family, and because they also have jobs, and it's very difficult to make the stars align in that way. So often what ends up happening is that, not just for reasons of being sick, but for lack of childcare or lack of transportation or, any type of thing like that, you can easily start racking up missed shifts. And so it's easy to lose these jobs. Right. And then it becomes kind of a stone rolling downhill because you end up in this process of getting essentially worse and worse jobs as you go because you're an unstable employee, but you're an unstable employee because the job doesn't pay well enough and is not consistent enough, right? So it's a little bit of a catch-22. So, with regards to sickness specifically, you know, um, if your child is sick and you don't have backup childcare, you're going to miss work, right? And if you miss work, you lose income. And, if you lose income, you lose housing. You see the problem, right? So poverty becomes this sort of self-perpetuating issue and cannot be pulled apart from housing at all. So I want to point out that these are not motivational issues. These are not failures of critical thinking, right? These are logistical issues, just straight up logistics. If you don't have a stable shift, no amount of strong planning skills is going to save you from having to figure that out on a week to week or even day by day basis. So I want to point out that regressive costs are those that hit poor people harder because though the amounts are the same, that because folks living in poverty have less money to start with, those costs are a bigger percentage of their um, assets, right? So, for example, if you have a car repair and it costs you $500, that $500 is going to hit you very hard if you only make $20,000 a year. But if you make $500,000 a year, you're not even going to notice, right? So, if you look at the ones that I've listed here, the ones on the screen, you can see how all of these things are regressive. I want to underline paying more for groceries because you can't buy in bulk because I think people don't think about this as much as maybe they should. Um, the the dollar store issue is why is everybody so upset about dollar stores kind of taking over from grocery stores? And the reason is that in the end, dollar stores are actually more expensive. They end up with $1.25 at this. It's not even a dollar anymore, right? They end up at $1.25 for, these food items or something. But if you were to go to the grocery store, you would get, five times as much for, $5, and then you would have saved yourself $1.25. And that adds up, right? That adds up over time. And so the problem is that if you don't have the funds to buy something that is $5 in bulk and you only have the $1.25, then you don't have a choice. You have to go to the dollar store. So, whether you're buying toilet paper one roll at a time or you're buying 20 rolls of toilet paper, you need to have the extra money on hand to buy in bulk. If you don't have it, you're not going to be able to do that. So, we have to think about how fees and additional costs impact folks at the very bottom of the income scale. The other thing that I want to emphasize here is that there is, again, a cultural difference. Middle class families often will intentionally teach their children about managing money and managing savings and keeping buffers in a way that low income families tend not to be able to do because they don't have the funds to be able to show how to do that. So it's very hard to learn these lessons after you have, essentially watched your entire family function in this way for your entire life. So it's very challenging when um, when poverty is generational, right? And there's nobody to show how it could be done differently. So just to go up to a slightly higher level of discussion, living at this level of, buying your toilet paper one roll at a time, of not having anything in the bank to cushion you if you need to buy a new tire or, anything at all, and having to put $3 of gas into the car at a time, the impact on your body is not something that you can ignore. So chronic stress is really the idea that we are living in a constant state of mental arousal, and that makes your body react in a way that is pretty toxic. Later on in the semester, we will examine stress as a factor in lots of different situations, but it changes your brain chemistry and it makes it really difficult to maintain or even develop in the first place good cognitive skills and strong structures. And, when you have that problem, you just have an array of symptoms that come from that. And it might not have anything to do with desire or motivation or anything like that. But if your brain is in crisis, you are not going to be at your best functioning. And when we talk about the cycle of poverty, it is a literal cycle, right? Because you can start at any point here to begin the conversation about poverty, and enter at any circle, and it takes you around and around. And there are a few ways out of this without disrupting the cycle in a dramatic way. And there's just not a ton of ways to do that. Permanent housing is one way to do that. Having an improved job situation where you actually can save um, can do that. But again, that often requires things like additional education. And if you are living paycheck to paycheck, you might not have time to get that additional education. So, the cycle of poverty is exacerbated by all these societal level factors, right? These macro level factors is like, racism and, the whole ideas of um, immigration crackdowns, not even your own personal immigration status. If your immigration status is a wobbly in any way, that can cause really incredible impacts on stress, on ability to navigate housing, because you're not as willing to put yourself out there, that sort of thing. And, there's also a bunch of individual factors that play into this. If you are a disabled person or you're somebody who's living with serious trauma, or you have a criminal record, that's a big one. It's very, very difficult to break out of this cycle. So, there's a an article that I have linked for you off of the Canvas hub page about the bootstraps myth, basically. It's an opinion piece, but it's from the New York Times, and there is this myth that you can essentially succeed at anything that you want to, and just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But the problem with that is that it assumes that everybody has the same starting point, and that just is not the case, right? So, if I come from a family with financial resources, then, they're going to be able to send me to a nicer college. They're going to be able to save for unexpected events. They're going to be able to provide a financial cushion for all sorts of things that might not be available to folks at the lower end of the income scale. So, you're not starting from the same point. So, your ability to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, it's a myth. It's a myth. So, you know, when folks say this, what they're not really acknowledging is that poverty is most often the embodiment of structural inequality. So, it's about how the systems that we live within are self-perpetuating to continue the cycle of poverty. And sure, there are ways out, but it's very difficult to get out of poverty without um, external help in some way, right? For example, a nice example of the external help. If you are an academically gifted student, and you come from a low income family, you can get a full scholarship to elite universities, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, whatever. If your family makes less than $100,000 a year or $150,000 a year, according to the school, you can go to any of those schools and a whole lot more for nothing. And some of them, Stanford comes to mind, will cover everything, not just tuition, everything, zero cost. So by the time you graduate, you have no debt at all. And that is a very, very strong path out of poverty. Education is an extremely effective way to break the cycle of poverty. And so it's critically important to try to figure out how to find your path forward in education if this is something that you're struggling with, so that you can leverage your resources. In this case, we're talking about academic strength to help yourself get out of poverty. And that's not bootstrapping, right? Like that is getting a hand up from an organization, in this case, a university. So that's all there is. If you have questions, we have discussion for this. In this module, there is a discussion. Um, it might be that you have gotten some ideas from this lecture, and if so, great. If you have any questions or anything that you want to chat about, you can absolutely post in the hub, send me a message, whatever. So hopefully we can have a great conversation jumping off from here, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks.